If we're talking about Black philanthropy and honoring our ancestors who, without fanfare, catalyzed entire movements simply by loving their communities enough to act, I think we owe it to our ancestors and we owe it to the young people who are coming behind us. Keep in mind, a lot of these movements started with young people. Dr. King, Ella Baker, a number of folks were young, right? And so if we have the model of young people sort of leading generationally, then we know that listening to them and creating space for them to strategize a more promising future through our investments, our governance, and our systems change strategies will sort of yield better and more promising results, as opposed to not listening, which means you can make a number of investments that haven't been validated, tested, proven, will not work, and you end up with that skate park and wasting dollars. And we just can't afford to waste dollars because our communities deserve the very best in our investments and thinking, and we have to do that with young people.
Welcome to Black Philanthropy, Our Stories, where each episode spotlights awesome Black and African American leaders committed to transforming lives and communities through philanthropy. These authentic conversations will inspire, challenge, and remind you, you are not alone. Here's your host, award-winning writer, director, and founder of Simuel and Murray, Michelle Renee Jackson.
We are so grateful for you today. As you know, we never take your time lightly today. We are excited to connect with Dr. Butler today. Dr. Butler she leads an amazing agency called the L.E.A.D agency.
I'm just so grateful that you were given the vision to sort of amplify our stories. And I am just a part of that journey. And so I want to introduce myself as someone truly honored and grounded to, first of all, be here. I don't take this space and this time lightly. So I'm Dr. Kimberlin Butler, the founder and chief possibility catalyst of the L.E.A.D agency, where we partner with philanthropy, education, and community leaders to reimagine how systems create opportunity, especially for young people. So I was born and raised in Louisiana. I'm actually from Baton Rouge. My family's New Orleans and Baton Rouge. And so my roots are really grounded in service, faith, and education. I started my career as a middle school social studies teacher to teach social studies, right? And to sort of build and invest in the brilliance of young minds around social studies as a teacher in Atlanta, the seat of the civil rights movement, where I saw firsthand the brilliance of young people and the barriers that too often limit our futures. And so that experience shaped everything that I do today. And so just wanted to say that the L.E.A.D agency specializes in something called Youth Possible Philanthropy. And so as an equity-centered framework that positions youth as co-creators in shaping philanthropic strategy and systems change. And I also want to share that I'm a certified impact philanthropy advisor. And I just became that about maybe 2 months ago. And it just simply means that I help funders, having been a funder myself and really understanding firsthand what it means to align investments with values, evidence, and community wisdom to drive real social impact. So more than anything, I'll just land by saying I see myself as a catalyst. I really, I'm someone who connects people, ideas, and possibilities. That's why I called myself the Chief Possibility Catalyst, to build systems where every young person knows that they belong and where they are capable and that they lead, which is in my agency's name, which stands for Learn, Excel, Achieve, and Discover Their Destinies.
You talked about Black philanthropy. That's a definition. Philanthropy is its own interesting collection of definitions. But for the purposes of our show today, can you help us understand how you define Black philanthropy in particular?
Yes, so much of Black philanthropy is rooted in my own story. So I should say I also come from two amazing parents who were not married. And I think that's really important to understand, that I grew up in a single parent home, but it didn't feel like it. My father was very engaged in my life. In fact, Jesse Butler, was my best friend, military veteran in the Vietnam War. And my mother, an amazing woman who graduated from college, and she went to an HBCU, and she scraped and pulled together as a government worker to make sure that we were never without. And so I always saw the power of philanthropy modeled through her first and foremost. And of course, my father is a servant leader and in the military. And so I just wanted to honor my family, and also want to call out my great-great-grandmother, Minerva, who I hear was amazing. And so I think about how, if she were to have a conversation with me, what might she say? And I know the stories that I've heard about her are just tremendous. And so I sort of stand on the shoulders of those folks in my history. So for me, to answer the question, Black philanthropy is love organized as a strategy. It's a catalytic force that turns generosity into leadership and faith into collective action, because so much of my story is anchored in faith. It is also how our communities have always sustained each other or one another. And so I think about church drives, I think about scholarships in education, I think about shared meals when folks may have needed a family, if they needed chosen family, right? And if they didn't have a strong sort of biological family. I think about the quiet acts of generosity that really made survival and success possible in the Black community when systems excluded us. And so to me, Black philanthropy is both deeply emotional, but also deeply intellectual. It's a reflection of our ability to design new systems with care. That's why I said it's love organized as a strategy, but also innovation, it's abundance rooted in dignity and agency, But Black philanthropy isn't performative giving. And I think that's the biggest thing I want to emphasize. It's not, giving for show. It's really transformational giving. For me, it's grounded in the belief that when one of us rises, we all rise, right? So success, one of the famous rappers, Jay-Z, said that, he measures success by those successful around you. And, him and sort of Beyonce have this song where they talk about, they could be anything. And so, but success is really about who's successful around you. So this sort of notion that we all rise, and, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. reminds us. So that's how I define Black philanthropy.
Let's talk about your role in Black philanthropy. What is your entry point into Black philanthropy?
So I see myself as a connector and a catalyst. I've always had a pretty vast network. And so I didn't really understand how to leverage that network, though, until I really adopted sort of this role as a catalyst for social change. And so I'm someone who sort of builds bridges between people, institutions, and possibilities, which is my favorite word. And so my Louisiana roots, Michelle, really taught me that generosity starts at the kitchen table. So much happened at our kitchen table. But my years teaching in Atlanta public schools, I think, because I have had experience on the front lines working with children and youth in Atlanta. And so that taught me that potential is everywhere. But when I saw sort of the seat that young people had to sort of make a difference and to wield their own power and impact in the world, I saw myself as the teacher that needed to catalyze those possibilities. So I took teaching very seriously. I took it as being a leader, right? And sort of advising young people through core subjects, of course, to be servant leaders, and to do that in the seat of the civil rights movement, and to be a constituent of the late John Lewis, who's my congressman, and to sort of bring those figures into the classroom was really special to me. So how I enter it is very much through this lens of having direct service and impact into the lives of young people, and reminding them that, their potential is everywhere, even when opportunity isn't, or if they don't see the opportunity. So through the L.E.A.D agency, I entered this, like I said, as a catalyst, but I've worked to transform philanthropy from the top-down structure into a shared ecosystem of purpose and power, and one where young people are not just participants, but also partners in shaping their own futures.
Why young people? Why are they so valuable to you?
So when I was in church, when I was younger, I grew up in a Baptist church in the South. Very important to note those things. There was a woman who said to me just about every Sunday, she said, Kimberlin, you were born to win. You were designed for accomplishments, engineered for success, and endowed with the seeds of greatness. Now, when you hear that over and over again, you actually believe it. So for me, because I was so young and I heard those words, I would often I would see my neighborhood around me. I would see that I grew up on the other side of the tracks, right? The side of the tracks that was discounted. I grew up in a very segregated community. Even in the Black community, we can get deep around classism, right? And sort of like how even in the brown paper bag, the lighter your skin color, the more acceptable you were. Those were things I saw in my community, whether they were named or not. And so when I think about young people and the messages that we receive on a regular basis, I focus on young people because I want to be the catalyst to sort of promote the positive sort of asset framing messages where they actually know deep down without a shadow of a doubt, like in their knowing and being whose they are, as we grew up saying, right? We're a child of God. But also that they were sort of, in entering society and born to actually win, right? Even when things are stacked against them, systems meaning. They could still disrupt those systems. I care about those messages that came to me. And so I want to create those opportunities for other young people. And so I chose to focus on them because the next generation, in my opinion, is the hope for a real promising future. And that cycle of generational impact happens and it comes to us all the time. But there's something very significant about young people knowing the power that they have, having the agency to wield the change that, that is possible. When I think about Nelson Mandela saying it always seems impossible until it's done. I want young people to see their role, that it can be done, and it can be done in partnership with philanthropy. And so that's that sort of legacy of creating Youth Possible Philanthropy, which I'm happy to talk about. It's sort of like continuing the circle of possibility through young people is why I focus on them.
So then let's talk about Youth Possible Philanthropy, which is trademarked. I appreciate what does that actually mean?
First of all, I want my legacy to be that I expanded the circle of possibility, as I was saying, around young people. And so Youth Possible Philanthropy is a framework in which I've introduced to philanthropy through the foundation review, but also anchored in my dissertation work. I got my doctorate in educational and organizational leadership at the University of Pennsylvania. And so I remember this sort of opportunity to focus either a dissertation on my employer at the time or focusing on something that I was really passionate about. And so hence the birth of Youth Possible Philanthropy. So through that, I'm helping to reimagine how philanthropy engages the next generation, ensuring that youth are not just invited into rooms, right? Checking a box, we asked young people what they thought, but actually helping design strategy and investments and seeing philanthropy as a civic engine, right? No matter what the sector that young people find themselves, seeing them as leaders that they deserve to be in shaping those systems that are meant to serve them, that funders are already investing in. So through the Youth Possible Philanthropy Practice Network, which I'm launching, so it's an exciting time domestically and globally, I'm building an ecosystem for funders and young change makers to work together, to learn to test and lead together. And the reason that's significant is because, as you know, having been a fundraiser, there are organizations that tend to write for grants and they put on this dog and pony show and look at us and all of that. But I had this young mentee, I'll never forget, which inspired a lot of this. And I remember that she was having an experience being lacking housing in New York City. But at the same time, she was speaking on a plenary stage at a Grantmakers for Education conference with me as a leader. She was speaking at the White House, which I've had a chance to serve. She was speaking, just paraded through a national nonprofit organization. And then it broke my heart and took me by surprise when she said, Dr. Butler, I'm actually homeless. I don't have a place to live. And I said, that's incongruent with everything that we thought you were experiencing. How did philanthropy miss this? Most importantly, what did we do wrong, right, as a sector to not like actually hear what she was going through? And why did we pay more attention to the organization that needed the grant dollars and miss the actual story of this young person sort of being paraded around as if everything was okay in her life? And so the incongruence of her experience and what the organization was saying and what philanthropy believed they were investing in really didn't sit well with me. And so Youth Possible Philanthropy sort of grew out of this notion of, we need to sort of really listen as a sector to the stories of young people and engage them regularly as funders and as practitioners, and also create space. Either through governing boards or in strategy and in other ways for them to actually name what's possible for their most promising future. So it's really this whole notion of, if you're really born to win, right, then the message and the architecture and invitation is like, I want young people to feel that same grounding in every system that they encounter. And I want our giving and our institutions to affirm that truth, that they belong, that they are seen, that they can lead, which I call learn, excel, achieve, and discover their destiny. So if philanthropy can bend in that direction, then my legacy will be more than, my work. It will be that this generation knows that it's their own truth and it's their own worth that matters. So that's what Youth Possible Philanthropy is about. And there are 6 components I should name, but essentially, it's about making sure that young people are engaging as participatory learners, that they're understanding and extending trust-based philanthropy in practice, that they're being trusted to sort of make those investments, that there's multi-sector collaboration, that there's equity-centered leadership, and so much more. But I just wanted to clarify that.
What is traditionally happening across the sector when it relates to funding for young people, so that our listeners who are perhaps in that sector where they support young people might be able to identify, oh, are we doing that thing that we might need to actually change?
Yes, so Youth Possible Philanthropy is really a call to practice regularly listening to young people and actually making investments in partnership with them. So what's happening traditionally is philanthropy is pretty top down. I talk about this in the Foundation Review article, so please go check it out. And it was released in May of 2025, so it's fairly recent and anchored in a lot of research. But what's happening is that philanthropy is, just investing dollars in organizations and thinking more programmatically and not thinking more strategy in terms of engaging young people. So if we know that young people are the best and most proximate voices to what they want to experience, why are we not asking them regularly what they need for their most promising future? And so what's happening is we're making a lot of assumptions. We're not testing those assumptions and validating those assumptions with their actual stories. And I want to be clear, I'm talking about youth who I describe as resilient, also known as marginalized youth. So the youth that are experiencing society on the margins, right? They're experiencing poverty. They are, experiencing disabilities or different abilities, if you will. And young people who are just not in a space where they're getting messages that they belong, right? And so in the case of my mentee, she lacked housing and no one saw her, right? And when she was actually seen, what did we do at that moment? Did we actually ask her what could be differently? Like if you were to redesign democracy or a system, right? What might you include in those things? And where can my foundation actually invest differently? Because what happens is, what may be relevant for the adults in a foundation, right, may not be relevant for young people who are actually experiencing those systems. So it's a call to stronger youth-adult partnerships as well, right? A lot of folks find it's a barrier to try to, engage young people because they think it's such an art or a skill, but really it's not. It's really just creating space to listen and listen regularly. And so my dream is that philanthropy would become this sort of civic engine, right? That it's currently not, for equity and imagination. So when I talk about possibility, we're talking about creating true spaces for young people to sort of name what's possible, to see themselves in a foundation strategy, to co-create the metrics right? How do they measure success, right? How do we start to measure well-being and belonging, and not just the quantitative sort of impact because of a grant, but how do you co-create that experience that young people need to have in systems with young people? How do you help young people design systems with you so that they can see the change that they actually want to see and that we all want to see in the world? But I think also it's important to call out, there's this $84 trillion wealth and intergenerational wealth transfer that's about to happen in history, right? And so if that $84 trillion is changing hands, my hope is that we will use this time to really reimagine that capital, like stewarded well, right? And so you can't do that without considering young people building the world in which they actually want to see, because generations will cycle. And I want to see philanthropy as a sector where foundations, donors, and young leaders really partner to move those resources with intention, with trust, but also community wisdom. So I just want to, just mention, for me, that is what Youth Possible Philanthropy sort of invites. It invites doing that on a very systemic, consistent basis, because it's not that there are pockets. There are a number of foundations who are starting to do or have been historically doing some of the engagement around young people well. But when you start to look at strategy, right, not just the investment in programs, we're talking about general operating support, but also governance, strategy, and systems change. It's bringing all of those together and doing it on a consistent basis and sort of creating like intentionality in the strategy to listen deeply, but to advance actionable knowledge after you actually hear what young people have to say. I'll give you one quick example. One funder who I won't name that I worked with, very influential foundation in a particular region. They actually had regional influence and national influence. Well, they hired me to partner with them to create their economic mobility strategy. They thought it was just going to be focused on education. And then they realized that actually this is broader, because young people obviously engage in systems beyond education. And so I love that they wanted to broaden the thinking. And so they had created this investment strategy. They thought investing like millions of dollars into a skate park. And then I said, well, who said that the community wanted a skate park? And they didn't really have answers. And they made this huge assumption. And so we went back to the drawing board and actually asked young people what they needed. And it was completely different. Their investment strategy shifted. Young people were created. There were spaces created for young people to actually name that they wanted access to more promising careers. They wanted to see people that look like them in the community achieving great feats and scaling walls of adversity. They wanted more than just laptop computers. They wanted to understand how to understand skills to fill jobs in the future. And these are very simple sort of things that young people needed, but the foundation didn't listen to actually hear the nuance behind those stories. And most importantly, they needed to hear from every young person and not just those they assumed they needed to hear from. So it was very disruptive, this strategy to actually listen, because it ended up shaping the entire 10-year economic mobility strategy. Imagine if we kept down the path of just investing in a skate park without actually listening to young people and the stories, validating why those needs were necessary and the systems that needed to change, because we heard their voices name the reasons why those systems needed to change and how they imagine those systems should be changed.
Dr. Butler, when you talk about young people, what age ranges are you talking about?
I'm thinking about, to be clear, I could talk about young people from elementary school, but I think because my career journey began in middle school and middle schoolers have my heart, I'm definitely talking about, 11 to, about college, sort of like entering into that young professional space. So the college access and completion. So about, 11, 12 years old to about, 20.
For communities that don't feel like they have the capacity to engage 11-year-olds to college-age folks, how do they create spaces to engage in those conversations with some sort of regularity in which they can connect with these young people in a language that everybody understands?
I want to be clear that this work is not just for folks who are passionate for or engaging young people directly. The sector has a responsibility to work with young people specifically if we're talking about investing. And when you think about proximal leadership, you can be in proximity with young people or be in proximity with systems that serve young people. And so the role of intermediaries become really important. And so all of my philanthropy colleagues would understand that intermediaries play a very important role. But I want to also be clear about the role of intermediaries. So my research talks about how some intermediaries have done a disservice in sort of shaping the investments or partnering with young people. And so I'm calling philanthropy to listen directly to young people and to sort of lean on intermediaries when necessary. So the answer to your question is sort of like, because the truth is, many organizations actually hesitate to engage young people until they feel fully ready, quote unquote. And that delay often becomes an excuse for inaction. And so what I've kind of learned through Youth Possible Philanthropy and what I've created is that readiness doesn't begin with expertise. It begins with intention in your investments, intention in your strategy, intention in how you get to know community and your framework and your culture around listening and building authenticity around how you engage in community-led philanthropy. So you don't need to be a certified facilitator or youth engagement specialist or even a teacher like I was to start creating space for young people. You just need to be authentic. I have seen presidents of foundations be really authentic and care about that in strategy. I've seen board members and governing bodies be really authentic and care. I've seen program officers when I was in philanthropy and working and specifically working at a place-based family foundation, I clearly cared about it. But you have to be authentic. You have to be curious and willing to share power. And that's the nature of the article that I wrote, is sort of like traditional philanthropy, as we know as a sector, it has something good about sharing power. And so there are some practical starting points that I'd recommend. And so first is start by listening deeply and not leading. We often go to a space of we need to lead, right? We need to lead and make these investments work. But what if you took the posture of like, let's invite young people into existing conversations that we're having already as a foundation as thought partners, not tokens, right? Because they are not to be tokenized. That's the invitation, to make sure that we're disrupting that sort of traditional practice of tokenizing and patronizing young people, but ask really open-ended questions like, what do you see that we might be missing in our investments? Or what would you change if you were in charge of this particular program? And, some program officers might be like, they may take our jobs, but isn't that the point, right? I was just working with another client where we created space for young people to invest nearly $250,000 in community in the ways that they saw fit. And it was quite magical to see the retreat where they shaped the RFP process, the young people, as well as they shaped the process for choosing organizations. And the vote was so powerful, and the deliberations that they had around where communities deserved investments through their lens was really powerful. And I would argue that that foundation could not do that without young people. So that invites to not just listen, but listen deeply and not just jump into leadership. You want to show some follow through. Show them that, what they are actually sharing actually shapes the decisions of the foundation. Because that example that I just gave, the foundation now has a responsibility to take that experience and invest in their strategy differently, because young people spoke and sort of stated what they need in their communities based on the investments and the youth participatory grant-making process they just went through. I think, secondly, shift the mindset from programming to partnership, right? Too often adults approach youth engagement as something to manage. I get it, right? Like, there are lots of programs to manage out there, but young people don't need managing. They need a sector to believe in them, right? So start small. Invite a few young people to co-design part of the meeting agenda, or to review grant guidelines for accessibility, right? Partnerships kind of grow from that proximity. And then I think the third thing I would offer is that, practice what I call possibility-centered design. And so that's kind of what I specialize in. But it's before you build a new program or an investment, ask, does this affirm that youth are born to win, as I mentioned, right? Designed for accomplishments, engineered for success, and endowed with the seeds of greatness. Like every process from grant making to evaluation and impact should really bend toward that affirmation and joy that we're trying to create. And it's all about embedding belonging and not performing inclusion, right? So inclusion shouldn't feel like performance. It should feel really transparent and genuine when you're engaging with young people. And so when organizations, Michelle, get that part right, when they start by listening, partnering, and affirming possibility, the learning will naturally flow, and it will start to feel like it's a part of your DNA, right, as a foundation. So that's why I created the Youth Possible Philanthropy Practice Network, to give funders, practitioners, and young people, most importantly, the funders and the young people, a place to learn together, to test those ideas and build confidence in doing this work really well. So you don't need to you don't need a certification, I want to be clear. You just need to commit to the principle that young people are co-creators, and not, tokens. They really are co-creators in the systems that are designed to serve them. And so young people are resilient. If you show that you are committed to them, they will stay with you through the strategy, and they will just really help you reimagine a philanthropy that works for everyone. And so when that belief anchors our culture, our organizations, and how we shift and move, every action that follows will feel more authentic, and the young people will see that. They can see everything, and they will tell you the truth. So that's my favorite part about working with young people.
I can imagine that there are colleagues in the sector of philanthropy who might feel like, why would I ask an 11-year-old on how I should invest funds into their community? They are 11 years old. What do they know? They don't have sort of the longevity of time to know what is good for them or what's best for them. And we're the adults. We have many generations on top of them. We have program officers who've invested in the time and the research to know. So I could just imagine that there is a high possibility of distrust, of asking young people, what do you want for dinner? Like, look, we're telling you what we're going to have for dinner, and how are we going to spend this money? We're not going to ask you. We're simply going to tell you because we know what's best for you. And I wonder why you're so convinced that young people from 11 to 20s and all their bumbling mistakes that we've all made, right? Not they, us, when we were that age, why they would be trustworthy with these funds.
I think first and foremost, the research says that we don't trust them. And so you've nailed something there. That's literally why I started this movement around Youth Possible Philanthropy. I think it's important to call out that we are not trusting the very people who are experiencing systems, whether we ask them or not, right? They're experiencing the democracy, the fragility of our democracy. They're experiencing leaders in Congress, that they don't trust, and they are being called to sort of inherit a future and do something with the mess that we've created as adults. And so, one, we should trust them because they're experiencing it, whether we believe they're experiencing life or not. And so we have to actually trust, right, that what they are seeing and sort of the proximity of like some of the challenges and systems, right? Like, how are they experiencing violence in community? How are they experiencing mental health and the lack of, sort of psychological safety in their schools? In a U.S. Department of Education event that I'm planning right now, and I'm planning the plenary stage sort of section listening to young people. And I'm working particularly, it's the first time they've ever had student voice sort of on the plenary stage. And it was my idea to make sure that we really listened and showed sort of like, what young people are experiencing. And I was taken all the way back, but not truly surprised, for a young person to say that as a leader, she still feels invisible in her school, in her culture. And she said that she feels like the bricks and sort of like the paint or sort of the pieces that are keeping the bricks together were not sort of like holding her together psychologically. And so what does that mean to actually hear a young person say that you believe you've created all of these systems in a school district that may seem like you hear me, but to actually state that she's not actually heard or doesn't feel a sense of belonging? Like, how are we missing that, right? And so I would sort of say, listening to the why leads to a better climate and better policies and strategies in schools and districts, for example. But there are also other systems that are beyond schools and districts, right? There are healthcare systems, right? When you're actually listening to how young people are experiencing their doctors or experiencing, how we care about their health and well-being. And so every system is impacted because young people show up in every system of our entire society. I think secondly, we can't afford not to listen to them because, again, the next generation will inherit the systems that believe in their potential from the very beginning, right? So if we're talking about Black philanthropy and honoring our ancestors who, without fanfare, catalyzed entire movements simply by loving their communities enough to act, I think we owe it to our ancestors and we owe it to the young people who are coming behind us. Keep in mind, a lot of these movements started with young people. Dr. King, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, a number of folks were young, right? And so if we have the model of young people sort of leading generationally, then we know that listening to them and creating space for them to strategize a more promising future through our investments, our governance, and our systems change strategies will sort of yield better and more promising results, as opposed to not listening, which means you can make a number of investments that haven't been validated, tested, proven, will not work, and you end up with that skate park and wasting dollars. And we just can't afford to waste dollars because our communities deserve the very best in our investments and thinking, and we have to do that with young people.
So what is an intermediary, and what does a disservice look like in that instance? And one of the reasons why I'm asking that, Dr. Butler, is because I think a lot of our listeners want to be as effective as possible. So if there are ways that you might identify that they might be unaware of how it might have been harmful, it might just help them on how they readjust for the future.
And an intermediary is a third-party organization that sits between a funder and a community. Sometimes they manage grants, they facilitate youth programs in this case, or they might provide capacity building support, depending on sort of why that intermediary organization was created. And they're really meant to help foundations reach communities more effectively. But what I found in my dissertation interviews, and later reaffirmed in my Youth Possible Philanthropy framework and practice, is that intermediaries sometimes end up protecting the system more than the people it's designed to serve. And so some funders expressed, quite frankly, in private conversations and interviews with me that some intermediaries they've worked with have really become gatekeepers rather than bridges, and some have been really ineffective and seeming to care more about their institution and organization than the actual work. And so it becomes more about a contract and not really about service. And I want to be clear, this is not every intermediary organization. And so my concern is that we run the risk if you end up working with an intermediary that doesn't have the right sort of mindset, DNA, culture, and then when you continue to work with them and it becomes sort of a comfort space to continue to work with the same organization, you're not asking the right questions about what they're doing, right, in service of young people, that's where the mistake sort of becomes detrimental to the young people you're serving. And so here's what that looks like in practice. A foundation might say, we want to engage youth in our decision making, but instead of partnering directly with young people, they hire an intermediary organization to do it for them. And so that intermediary runs the meetings, they set the agendas, they filter what young people say before it reaches the foundation. And suddenly the authenticity of youth voice gets lost in translation. And so that is the value of a youth possible philanthropy. So one young person in my study said, we were invited to the table, but the table was already set, right? So that's an example, right? So that's what I mean by a disservice. It's when engagement becomes performative rather than participatory. And so while intermediaries may play a valuable role, foundations have to be really careful that those structures don't replace trust-based direct relationships with young people, because there is a difference. And even though it might seem easier to just work with an organization, Youth Possible Philanthropy really calls us to shorten the distance, to build proximity and trust and not layers of control. And so when foundations engage directly with young people, the listening to generations, like we talked about, right? If you really don't know those generations, how cool is it to actually listen, co-create, and then compensate young people? You have to compensate them for their time as strategic partners. To me, that's when transformation really begins, and my research confirms that.
Well, one of the things as you're talking, it just reminds me, because I'm a business owner, a small business owner, MWBE certified in the state of New York owner. And the reason why I say that is because to me, this sounds very basic, which is to say, if I'm going to offer a new service or a new product to a market, it behooves me to make sure that the market wants that thing. And that ultimately our job as business owners is to solve someone's problem. And so then, of course, you have this industry or sector that is ultimately positioned to solve many, many, many problems at a high level through its funding. But it sounds like part of what you're saying is the observation is that there's not always, and often probably less often than not, what's happening is that people are like, I just want to solve this problem, and I haven't engaged the people for whom that is applicable. And that if funders could just get down to the very basics of, if you're looking to solve the problems, then why don't you engage the individuals who are experiencing those problems so that you can make sure that what you're offering actually applies. And that sometimes happens, of course, we know now with participatory philanthropy, but it sounds like, but even though that's happening, there's still this other group, the young people who are like, yeah, but what about us? What has been the reception? Has it been positive? Has it been with resistance or some trepidation?
I think, one, I want to be clear, it's an emerging framework, right? So that's the exciting part, and why I appreciate being a part of this podcast, because the practice network is actually going to test and show examples of like why this model is really important. I think so far, and that will be released soon in another article, working with an organization, the one that I mentioned, where the youth sort of made investments as sort of an entity, sort of partnering directly inside the foundation to make investments. I think that is a great example of like how when you trust young people to shape investments and they think about even the themes around those investments, right? Because if you think about it, setting the table would be this particular foundation saying, okay, young people, we're going to bring you together. We've invited you across the community to think about investing in X, Y, and Z. We just need you to administer the grant and invest in X, Y, and Z. What this foundation did, which is what's different, which is why there are signals that Youth Possible Philanthropy is really promising, is they sort of said, we will let you take full control of the process of how we design this RFP. We will create a structure for you to think about what, sort of goals and outcomes this RFP will have. We will also recruit different pockets of the community to make sure that there was sort of this, sort of intersectionality representing all of the community, including those with different abilities, sort of experiencing the process of giving. And we will also trust your deliberation once you set those themes on like what giving will do for the community, and sort of like listen to like your lived experiences and living experiences in those communities, making those investments in the communities that you're sort of deciding the funds will sort of, transform. And so that is very different than saying, we're just going to invite, you to make a decision around these grants in a process that we've already set. I literally watched the young people deliberate, disagree, have healthy dialogue around the disagreements that they had around what would work in their communities. But most importantly, I saw their voice be trusted in a meaningful way. The multi-sector collaboration that this process of Youth Possible Philanthropy, our framework, invites is young people sit at different points across the systems where they live. And so because they got to shape the investments to impact different parts of the system, they naturally were a part of that collaboration. And because they were referred to the foundation through the different systems that recognize their value, it sort of became a cycle where now they have a pathway to sort of influence and take a leadership role in the very systems where they serve. So you're starting to see young people as a result of the work that, again, it's emerging. So over time, you'll see more examples, but some of these young people are now advocates, they're public speakers in the systems that they're impacting. Some of them have advocated in town hall and in different sort of school board meetings, but definitely city town hall systems. They're speaking to leaders, guiding some of the systems where they see themselves leading. They're on podcasts. I saw one young person develop the logo. The foundation commissioned their artistic ability to develop the logo for the sort of body of young people that were making an investment in community and the grant-making committee. And now the foundation is also considering putting them on the governing board just because of this process that has only been going for about 3 years, right? So you start to see sort of promising opportunities for young people to sort of, because philanthropy partnered with them in a very strategic way, ceded power, yielded, sort of the power to make sure that they truly trusted them and they listened. I mean, I know for a fact that the foundation is in a better place because they engage the community through the lens of young people differently. Now, I want to say, sort of juxtapose that against another foundation that I work with. Again, won't name names, but they actually have a similar sort of youth-focused or sort of body, sort of making investments. The difference is the young people are trusted to give advice around the investments, but not to actually make the investments, right? The board of the foundation still takes the advice from the young people, but they ultimately don't have the final decision. So imagine the different experiences of the young people who are trusted all the way through to make those investments, given their rationale, the deliberations, et cetera, versus the young people who were, totally trusted to make those investments all the way through. And the announcement and the gratification and the belonging they feel when it's announced to the public, which in this case, the foundation announced to the public that young people, this particular body, made investments anchored in their lived experiences, and they decided that these are the organizations that deserve that funding. So it's bigger than just funding. I want to call out that it's also the leadership journey that the young people experience. It's also adults saying, "I see you." In South Africa, Sawubona is one of my favorite words. It's "I see you," right? And so how do our processes and practices and in philanthropy and our strategies communicate that to young people or even the community writ large, because young people make up the community as a system, as a whole. I see you throughout every generation. My investments need to speak to that. I see you.
Dr. Butler, I do want to ask you, these are awesome examples of what is working. And I wondered if there are any examples where you've seen partnership with youth and young people that has not worked and what the lessons were from that, perhaps.
First of all, I never get asked this. This is why your podcast is so powerful, Michelle, because oftentimes people want to jump into the what do we need to do? And they don't pause to think about what is required and sort of the do no harm, right? And so I want to sort of talk about, in the instance where you can do more harm, right, than good. In my dissertation, in the Foundation Reviewed article, I heard many stories of foundations trying, right, to engage young people, but unintentionally setting them up for frustration or failure. And so a few common patterns that emerge when organizations don't do this well. One, I just want to name that it's important to pay young people. And so when you pay young people, making sure that the systems and kinks are worked out to pay them on time and to pay them well. Because there are some instances where I've seen foundations miss the opportunity to sort of say from the start that we value you enough to pay you for your time and the listening. And the ones that did, they had a smooth process, not perfect, but they figured out all the kinks to make sure they were paid on time. On the other hand, those who just sort of said that, but the process was just not smooth. The young people were like, wait, when are we going to get paid? What happened? That you wouldn't want your paycheck to sort of, go missing or not show up on time, right? You have a mortgage to pay or rent to pay. And so young people have a life too, right? So I think the first pattern I want to sort of share is that, inviting youth too late in the process, right? So foundations often spent months developing a strategy and only then brought young people in to sort of react to it. So at that point, decisions were already made. So young people actually, saw that their input wouldn't really change the outcome. They were just, they were disengaged. So one participant told me we were there for the optics and not the outcome, right? That's an example. So another one would be under-resourced youth participation, as I was mentioning. Many partnerships offer stipends that barely cover transportation. You got to think about, depending on the area, if it's an urban community, suburban, you name it, rural even, when there was no compensation at all. And this sent a clear message to young people whose time, was actually valued. The lesson is compensate youth fairly and invest in the supports that make participation actually equitable. Think about childcare. Think about, because if you're dealing with young parents, it's very important. Think about travel, translation, and mentorship, right? This is an opportunity to build their social capital because you're naturally engaging with young people as a funder. I think also tokenism disguised as inclusion. I've heard examples of youth advisory boards, so many youth advisory boards, right? And they meet once or twice a year where young people were photographed for the annual report, but never saw how their insights actually shape the grants, strategy, and outcomes of a foundation. So the lesson here is if engagement isn't sustained or connected to a real decision-making power, then it reinforces the very inequities philanthropy claims to solve, right? So I think another one is, as we mentioned earlier, intermediaries controlling the narrative, right? Sometimes foundations outsourced youth engagement and listening to an intermediary organization that sort of pre-screened or softened what youth were actually saying before it actually reached funders. And so the authenticity and the hard truths were filtered out. And so the lesson is proximity really does matter. That's why I created Youth Possible Philanthropy, because philanthropy has to build direct, trusting relationships with young people, not relationships mediated by fear or discomfort, right? Like they are an opportunity to hold up, not a mirror, as we say in the sector, it should be an X-ray where you see the crevices of the change that actually need to happen. An MRI and an X-ray shows you something very different than a mirror. A mirror just shows you yourself. And then the last one I talk about is sort of adult-centric definitions, right, of professionalism. So a few foundations unintentionally policed kind of youth expression, like correcting their tone, their language, and attire instead of listening for insight. So young people, the lesson here is create those spaces where youth can bring their whole selves, right? Because authenticity is expertise. So across these examples, I think the common thread is control, adults holding onto rather than ceding power. And so when philanthropy treats youth as partners rather than participants, or the word that I really can't stand, which is beneficiaries, everything really shifts, right? So the learning becomes mutual, the impact becomes real, and the process itself becomes really transformational. And so that's why I developed Youth Possible Philanthropy, to move the field. It's a field building framework that moves us from symbolic engagement to systemic change, from listening to really like engaging young people as leaders in the communities that they want to change.
One of the things that we often talk about, Dr. Butler, is this sense of why you, why now? And what the context of that question for many of our listeners who might be listening for the first time is this sense of, some people, this is because we're living in a time that is very discomforting. I think regardless of what one's political ideology is, I think everyone is a little on alert on what's happening right now. And And that can lead to despair, that can lead to hopelessness, that can lead to a sense of why even bother. And the thing that what gives me hope, and I'd be pleased to hear about what gives you hope, but what gives me hope in the sense of how I show up in the world is that I am convinced that not just my life, but your life, and I think all of our lives right now, that they do have purpose, that they do have meaning, that is actually intentional, that I'm here right now and that I wasn't born in 1860 or 1760 or in 3060. That maybe the reason why I'm alive right now is that my purpose, my calling, my reason for being is actually for this moment that we're living in. And the way that I answer that is as an artist, as a writer, as a director, as a photographer, doing this podcast, helping to transform how people think about slavery through some of the films that we do. To me, that's why I'm here right now, and why I think that's why I put my head down. Well, I keep my head up, but I keep my head also on task. Why I work 16, 17 hours a day, 8 days a week, 25 hours a day sometimes, right? And so I wanted to offer that question to you, given the passion that you have for youth, and how you see a ball that's being dropped by a sector that is in the position to change the world. Why you right now? Why you, and why now for you?
I believe that young people are truly the repairers of the breach. I just think that so many systems are broken, and this is a very unique opportunity to actually listen to them for real. And so I believe I was created for this time, this era. Some people say moment. I think it's quite frankly deeper than a moment that demands a catalyst, right? And that's why I call myself the Chief Possibility Catalyst, because I just see myself as sort of being called to catalyze, opportunities. And what I want to sort of bridge generations and institutions, and also call into imagination and what young people are imagining, a world. I remember a long time ago writing this speech as a young person, My Voice in Our Democracy, long before the things we're experiencing now. And I also remember being a young person in the youth legislature in Louisiana, where I'm from, sort of writing a bill focused on secondhand smoke that was informed by my lived experience of my uncle actually suffering from lung cancer. And a lot of sort of that mock sort of legislation, but a lot of those solutions in partnering with philanthropy in my community, et cetera, was anchored through my own lens as a young person. And so this is an era where philanthropy must redefine itself, right? You can't do the same things. It's just, we have to move from generosity to justice, to move from extraction to co-creation with young people. And so my role as a scholar practitioner and a strategist, and also a certified philanthropy or impact philanthropy advisor, my role as a scholar practitioner, strategist, and certified impact philanthropy advisor, it's really to guide the sector in that shift with both head and heart. I always say this is hard work, but it's also heart work, and it's the two together. So I carry this conviction, much like you, Michelle, in that I was sort of destined for this kind of leadership to help philanthropy live up to its promise as a partner in building a more equitable, youth possible world. And that's why I do this work.
We're grateful for you doing this work. Dr. Butler, how can people stay in contact with you?
Yes, you can reach me on social media, on LinkedIn, but also you can reach out to me at Kimberlin at LEADagencyllc.com or connect at LEADagencyllc.com. You can also visit my website at www.theleadagencyllc.com. And I'm everywhere you are willing to convene. Because I am in philanthropy and community with my folks in, the Association of Black Foundation Executives, or ABFE, as well as grantmakers for effective organizations and other organizations that are committed to this work.
So where can we find this article that you've alluded to?
It's the Foundation Review, and I will share the link. It's volume 17, issue number 1. So Foundation Review, which is a peer-reviewed journal article specifically designed for the philanthropic sector.
So we will make sure to include that article, a link in our show notes in case anyone, and I'm sure they will, be excited to be able to read that article. We are so grateful for you. Thank you for the work that you've done on behalf of young people and reminding us that you don't have to have some youth development program, that this is for all of us, that you gave nobody an out today. And I think people were like, well, that's for them over there. No, it's for you, because this transfer of wealth is going to happen, and this generation is coming up, and we've got to be in a position to support them, regardless of what your funding priorities are. Young people are a part of that, no matter who you are. So thank you for the steps that you provided with Youth Possible Philanthropy. You are a blessing. We're grateful for you. And I wanted to offer you the question of, is there anything that you'd like to say before we scram today?
We're at a difficult time in our country, Michelle. So I would just offer, what gives me hope. And I hope that it invites folks to be a part of the change and to not shrink back. This is a time to lead with courage, to lead with compassion and creativity. Again, I'll say courage is what I personally feel. The resiliency of the young people that I represent, they're the voices of the voiceless, right? Until we give them a voice. But to lead with courage, compassion, and creativity, I see communities reclaiming power. And so reimagining democracy is the invitation, and I'm excited about that. Redefining what's actually possible. So for me, this isn't just a feeling, it's a discipline. And so I want to just leave with the audience that let us be disciplined in our practice, right? Let us be unapologetic, unashamed of the daily decision to believe that transformation is still within reach, and to do that with young people. So we each have a role to play to make that real. And so again, philanthropy is just really at this precipice to be a civic engine for social good, but to do it with young people who are the next generation. So that's what I would leave. Thank you so much for having me, Michelle. It's been a pleasure.
It's been our pleasure. Thank you to our listeners. Neither Dr. Butler nor I take your time for granted. We're all going to go back to our desk, or get off our lunch, or get back from lunch, or get back on the treadmill, or whatever we're doing today to do this work that is meaningful, regardless of your sector. Thank you for trusting us with your time today. You are important, you're valuable, and most importantly, you're not alone. Dr. Butler is there. I am there. All of our colleagues are there. So you know how to reach me. You now know how to reach Dr. Butler on any one of the platforms. So we are here for you. Thank you for being with us today on Black Philanthropy, Our Stories.